Good evening, everyone, and welcome to everyone who is just coming in and joining us. I can see there's a few dozen of us already. Please let us know in the chat where you are. I can see a big rush of people going to type again, and some familiar names and faces there, which is just fantastic. I always enjoy this part, just seeing where everyone is. Oh, there we go. A big all caps hello from Anne Stafford from Bomaderry, and saying hello to George as well, and a few others typing away there. Oh, very nice. Rose in her studio at Windsor. Anna Glynn from Shoalhaven. I'm on the lands of the Bungarang and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations here in Melbourne. George, where are you? You're not very far.
I'm over the river from you. Not very far at all. I'm not in a Cobbett hotspot.
Yes,
we don't
hesitate to say it's been very distressing seeing our neighbours to the north actively discouraging people from interacting with us.
It's discouraging. It's also, but I expect next trip to the supermarket it'll be deja vu all over again.
Oh, I hope not. I really, really hope not. Miriam Abud, who is also on Wurundjeri country, is in a hotspot. She says, there is Michaela Nutt from Luton in the UK. Lovely to see you again, Michaela. Margaret Hancock from Ghana country. Hello, Margaret, from Jam Factory in Adelaide. Wendy Garden from Darwin, Land of the Larrakia people. Really, really lovely to see everybody coming in. Now, as you're coming in, who was here last week for the discussion with Michaela? And goodness me, that's I've been really feeling for her colleagues and everyone at the ABC today, and we will get into that in a little minute, I am sure. So as we're all coming in, as you all know, this is the NAVA Advocacy Program. My name's Esther Anatolitis. I'm the Executive Director of NAVA. Joining us also on the line is Leah. Leah Reid is our Advocacy and Communications Manager. She's on the chat. And you'll see that Leah has already posted up and pinned the link to the live captioning. So you can click on that if it's helpful to have the live captioning as we're speaking. That is right there. We are also, of course, recording and transcribing, and the recordings and the transcriptions are available the very next day, which just always strikes me as being absolutely amazing. Helen, our captioner, is in Brisbane. So hello to Helen again, and thank you for your very fast work in live captioning. Now, for this session, as you know, we have been breaking up our advocacy program into chapters, focusing on the arts, focusing on advocacy questions, on policy questions, on media questions for these 4 weeks, and then getting far more deeply into the political questions, because advocacy, of course, is a complex set of conversations and happens in a range of different platforms. I am so thrilled that George Megalogenis was available and happy to join us this afternoon, because I always get so very much from our conversations, and many of you know George as Australia's finest political explainer. So it's my great pleasure to welcome George Megalogenis, author and journalist. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Esther, and welcome all. I see a lot of hellos in the corner. I'll try not to read too many texts while we're doing this. I'll try and focus on the questions, but much appreciate everyone who's tuned in.
It's great having our parallel of speaking and commenting. I hope everyone's got the comment view open. And please, as we go, add your notes and your thoughts and questions for George, because as far as is possible, it's just so great to be able to make this conversational. So, look, there is so very much to talk about, but before we get into some specifics around figures, around recent figures, economic and employment data, and the broader impacts of this current period on arts and culture, George, let's talk about the role or the place that arts and cultural policy has for our current government. We've long established in our conversations these past months that, of course, there is no written arts and cultural policy in Australia. There certainly has not been one that has survived a change of government. But we do know, and we certainly observe and judge and interpret the government based on the decisions they make, whether those are policy decisions, funding decisions, etc. So on what is observable, what do you see the role, the function, how are they using arts and cultural policy?
So the government as an entity, the Conservative government, we've had 3 prime ministers since 2013, and the one in the middle, not Tony Abbott and not Scott Morrison, Malcolm Turnbull, is a philanthropist at heart and very, very pro the arts, a very cultured individual. But I think across the 3 prime ministers, there's a very, very consistent theme, and that is that arts isn't a priority for them in terms of money they want to spend, things they want to talk about. That doesn't mean that they want to destroy the arts, but it's not front of mind for them. And the way I view the coalition, the way it's governed over this sort of triple cycle now through the 3 prime ministers, is that they are clinging to a part of Australia. There's sort of 2 parts to Australia that are very, very strong for them, Queensland and Western Australia in an electoral sense, but also culture in a sense older rather than younger Australia. And obviously within older Australia, there is a very, very strong constituency for the arts, but it's not one that the coalition readily associates in its messaging. So they don't talk much about the arts to older Australians, even though older Australians themselves are into the arts, because they don't think it's a vote winner for them with that constituency. And this is a bit of a paradox when you think it through. Robert Menzies, if he could crawl out of his grave, he'd be shaking his fist at the contemporary Liberal Party. And
I imagine he would be on many counts.
He'd be struggling to understand what had happened to his party, because his party was the party of the middle class. His party was in coalition with the old Country Party, was the party of regional Australia, was really the party of sort of well-mannered Australia. And the working class, the Labor Party, was the party of, sort of sport and a few other things. But it wasn't really, and trade unionism, it wasn't really that sort of mid-brow or even upper middle-brow sort of cultured, well-mannered Australia. Now, so I think that's something to sort of start almost as your baseline observation. But within the coalition constituency, and this is where the paradox comes in, art lovers, people who go to galleries, people who go to theatre, because they represent and they reflect the broader community. And this is a stat I always like to quote within our particular home in Melbourne. More people will go to the NGV over the course of the year than will go to the MCG. That's right. And people are twice as likely to go to the NGV, the equivalent gallery in Sydney, which is a Melbourne-Sydney observation. But for the Conservatives, why wouldn't that be part of your story and your conversation with Australia? Well, it just so happens that the people who are associated with the creation of the arts are viewed as a bit left of centre. And so for the Conservatives, these people are not their people. So the performers, the artistic community itself isn't seen as a natural constituency. Whereas tradesmen might well be seen as a natural constituency, farmers might be considered viewed as a natural constituency, miners and the like. Parents who send their children to private schools, but when the kids enter university, they become Labor voters or they become Green voters. So that once the kid is separated from the household unit and ends up in university, they become another priority or less of a priority. So that's the way to think about it. It's neither a good nor a bad thing. It's just the way they see the country. And I think that is why you're probably getting a sense right now, because COVID has accelerated a lot of pressure points. It's done more than accelerate. It's broken open a whole lot of conversations that the country needs to have about where the government sits, where the private sector sits, how you hold a community together. And I haven't heard much out of the government that tells me that one of the things they see as central to holding community together is a vibrant art sector.
Yeah, I think that's that is a completely that's a characterization that is really easy to relate to. That sense of who and what the government sees as their kind of natural constituency, as opposed to, and I think this is an evolution of global politics in the English-speaking world. This sort of notion of addressing or playing to the base, as opposed to governing for all Australians. What would Menzies say if he rolled out of his grave?
Well, who are you? I think that's what he'd say.
Yeah.
I think he'd say, who are you? But the political animal in him will be intrigued that the Conservatives are able to transfer out of the Labor column, the blue collar male, into the coalition column. But he'd be just as intrigued that women have switched from Conservative voter to Labor voter. So he wouldn't recognise the country, but the political animal in him would start to compute very quickly what the transaction was. And I think he'd be concerned. The reason why he'd be concerned is this is not the country that he imagined when he was Prime Minister for the 16 years, from 1949 through to 1966. The country he thought he was building was a white Australia with European migration. The country he thought he was building valued education and valued values.
And so if we look at the broader arts community, arts industry, the people who make art, it's far more diverse than that. It is very active and engaged. It is, on the whole, more educated than the average Australians, and so perhaps that is something that that Menzies would have been interested in. But this notion of where the government or where the coalition is going at the moment, and the difference between, as he started setting that out, those three prime ministers, each in their own approach, depict recognisably Liberal or coalition values, and yet at the moment the approach to, as we're also seeing in the comments here, the approach to, as Miriam puts it, the arts, the ABC, community broadcasting, humanities courses, there seems to be an attempt to remove criticism and interrogation. And it's a very different notion of, I guess, citizenship as well, isn't it? I mean, citizenship takes us to that broader question of who can come into this country and the circumstance in which they come. It takes us to our treatment of asylum seekers, the way that we empathise and don't empathise with others. Just how disjointed or disconnected is the current government from Australians' thinking on this? Because you've given this a great deal of thought and work.
This is a really good question. So, in a sense, what we're trying to do, as I follow the conversation, we're trying to unpack the why they think this way, and who they think they're representing in the way they relate to the electorate on this issue. And I think it's just the way the electoral map plays out. The southeast corner of Australia, the most cosmopolitan part of Australia, which is essentially Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra. Canberra is a public service town. Melbourne and Sydney are very cosmopolitan towns, but between those three jurisdictions, you've got a propensity to vote Labor. You've got a younger, better educated constituency. They're very complex and very diverse cities, each of them, but you've got, I wouldn't call that your creative corner, by the way, because I don't want to narrow cast the arts community as just these three cities. But in terms of the way the coalition sees the electoral map, that southeast corner, that most cosmopolitan part of Australia, doesn't turn up for them at election time. Queensland does, Western Australia does, regional New South Wales does. And at the last election and at the election before, even though Malcolm Turnbull was the Prime Minister going into the 2016 election, Queensland and WA, as I mentioned earlier, voted overwhelmingly for the coalition. Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, in fact, all of New South Wales, when you totaled up all the seats, voted Labor. But there was a big disconnect between the city and the regions. So in that, beginning with that is the electoral map, the way the coalition sees it. They obviously want to look after their base. Now, looking after their base, and this is a base that faces higher unemployment than average. This is a base that's older than average. this is a base that's less diverse than average. The conversations, the strategic conversations they want to have with that group isn't about raising their sort of artistic and intellectual pursuits. It's about getting them a job, and it's about trying to hang on to their sense of what the country still is, even though they realise that the country is changing very, very quickly. So I think the complication for them in managing a diverse portfolio of interests and a diverse portfolio of needs within an electorate, it's a lot easier for them to set up these binary choices between jobs and between trees, between jobs and the environment more generally, and climate change, between lower education, needs of people who are on the margins versus people who can look after themselves in tertiary education. Now I know these things sound very clunky and very binary, but that is the way they see the country. That doesn't mean that Labor is any more enlightened. Labor, of course, view that part of the country as redneck, as disconnected from where Australia is heading, and they don't know how to talk to each other. We know that the two parties don't know how to build bridges between these two constituencies, because the last two elections, Coalition won by 2 seats or by 1 seat. So the margin at the 2019 election was just 2 seats. The margin in 2016 is a single seat. So that's, in a sense, that's your starting point. That's your complication. So within that frame, within that very narrow frame of a polarised and divided electorate, you would almost need a Prime Minister and their cabinet to really value the arts, to make it a priority, notwithstanding the perception that it is in the vote for them. So it has to come from within. And I think just looking at the way they react to the calls for funding, to the calls for JobKeeper, to the calls for support during COVID, it's not a priority for them. I don't think they want to destroy the sector, but I think it's not a priority for them. And because it's not a priority for them, I don't think, A, their constituency views it as a priority, even though I'd argue that it's a much more complex equation. But B, more importantly, it's not something they feel. And it's not something they will think to prioritise.
Yeah, I think that sense of that feeling and thinking to prioritise is a huge factor here. And there's so many disconnections between data and approaches here. There's so much data that shows that just about everyone in Australia engages with the arts no matter where they are. You mentioned earlier more people going to the NGV than the MCG. And then if we take a look at some of the more recent data, and people are starting to comment about that job outlook stuff, which we will touch on in just a sec. Let's look at the impact of the pandemic on the sector, because that starts to give us a sense of economically and in terms of jobs and outlooks, the scale and the scope of the arts and culture sector, but also some of the problematic classifications that can make it difficult for government to get that bigger grasp. So George has got some figures handy, because he always does.
Yeah, I'm going to keep these numbers as simple as possible. We won't be putting graphs up. But I have had a look at some numbers for you just before we set up this conversation. Now, arts and recreation, it's a very, very broad category, but when the Bureau of Statistics defines employment by an industry group, it lumps arts and recreation in together. Now, arts and recreation includes not just the performing arts, not just the galleries, it also includes community sport. So it's a very, very strange classification, but there are 250,000 people, loosely defined, that were in this sector employed in February of 2020. Now we know from the real-time payroll data that the Bureau of Stats puts out every fortnight that there's been a stand down, i.e. people have had their jobs put down, reduced to 0 hours. Some have lost their jobs, some are in hibernation, but basically a third of that sector has lost its work. So it's about 50,000 out of the 200. It's more than 50,000 out of 250,000. Now I have to cut and dice it for you. So if we take sport out, sport's important, but if we take it out, we've still lost a third of narrowly defined the arts sector. Now, unfortunately for the government, when it looks at those tables, it sees at the very top Health and Community Assistance is the largest employer in Australia. It sees the largest employer of men as construction. It sees retail as a very, very large employer. These are sectors that employ over 1 million people each. Whereas we're looking at a subsection of the sector that only employs, according to the ABC definition, just a quarter of a million each. Now, these are jobs that are not easily saved because they rely on people. They rely on an audience. This is a tricky thing. So even, let's get personal for a split second. So the minute the lockdown happened in late March, I had 6 months worth of work disappearing. Writers' festivals, presentations and the like. 6 months worth of work, and that would be the experience across the board. And remember, a lot of the people in this sector, let's talk about film and television, for example, are all on temporary contracts. They may have a number of temporary contracts, which adds up to a career, but they don't have a single employer that could apply for JobKeeper on their behalf. So very quickly you had this sector for health reasons, it has to lock it down. To support it, and this is where I go back to the data, to support it, it's actually not a big deal because there are not that many people to support. But if your government is thinking about, and your unemployment rate's going to go to 10 very quickly and possibly to 20 in lockdown, at least 15 to 20, you're going to worry about the sectors right up the top where the 500,000s and the millions are employed. And you can see in the way they have negotiated a JobKeeper, and you can see in the way that their head has almost exploded once they had to think about the complexity in the performance space, that they've frozen. Now, and I think, and I don't think this is deliberate. I think at some point, especially with a pandemic, you only get one of these every 100 years, according to our history. And there's no one alive today that remembers the Spanish flu. And there's probably no one of a working age that's involved in any organisation, that's involved in government or advising government or runs a business or is even employed marginally, that remembers the last depression. You have to be pretty old to still remember the last depression and still be fit and able to work. So they've been confronted with a challenge that's off the charts in terms of its complexity. And this is why I go back to that first point. If it's not something you feel deep within, you're not going to be able to prioritise it, because there are a lot of other things that they don't necessarily come first because they're more important. They become more pressing because if you make a bad decision about retail, if you make a bad decision about construction, or if you have to shut down your mining sector and suddenly there's no income at all coming in from exports, you collapse your entire society. Not just your economy, your society is very, very difficult to hold together. So I do have some sympathy for them, but the longer this crisis runs and the more they resist the idea of going down to that next level of support for sectors that, through no fault of their own, have had to be shut down to manage a pandemic, the longer they leave constructive discussion in that area, the harder it is for me to view this as just the difficulty of the challenge. Like, it starts to feel personal at that point. I'll just hop back a bit. Apart from the arts, of course, the single sector that's lost the most number of jobs is restaurants, cafes, and pubs. And they've lost they've lost the equivalent of the entire sport and recreation sector alone. So they've lost a third of their jobs, close to 300,000.
Yeah, absolutely massive.
And that is a big employer. But the difference there is, and a lot of that work is casual, a lot of these people that have been stood down are probably re-employable. So when people were arguing the toss about whether it should be JobKeeper or dole for somebody working in a cafe, look, I can see the economics arguments both ways. I could see the social arguments both ways. But if I was a government and I wanted to try and lock down as much of the society to deal with the pandemic and then protect as many jobs as I possibly could, I could see how I would say, look, I don't want to overinvest in casual work because those workers are going to go somewhere else. Now, I'm not trying to sound like a cynic here. I'm just trying to figure out how you prioritise something like this. But the arts sector, if you take the same attitude to the arts sector, which is obviously what they've done, so the equivalent transaction in restaurant cafes is to, well, just let the dole take care of itself. If you then let the dole take care of itself in the arts sector rather than some sort of structural support that means that every arts organisation, as well as every sporting association is in hibernation in a proper way, like all the people are still attached to the organisation and are ready to go as soon as the doors open again, you would not be doing what you're doing now. You'd be intervening. You'd be intervening in a sort of government control kind of way, like a command economy. You'd say, I prioritise this sector. This sector has to survive because I know that if I don't go in there now, all the people in this sector are going to sort of fracture and splinter and sort of disappear in all directions, and they'll never come back.
Yes.
Okay, so the government. So I don't care. Yeah. So conceptually, as an economist, whether you have 900,000 or 600,000 people employed in restaurants, cafes, and pubs is neither here nor there if the other 300,000 were employable. But if you go from 250,000 on the narrow definition of the arts, recreation, and sport, so we'll include sport in this one as well, because sport's quite an important thing. People need to get out, right? People need to be able to play, and people need to be able to participate for the same reasons. You need to be stimulated. You need to go to a comedy festival, you need to go to a gallery, you need to go to the theatre. All these things are part of a rich life. So if you're a government and you say, I can't let these people go anywhere else, you would not be doing what you're doing now.
Yeah.
So as I say, literally the equivalent of treating a casual worker at a coffee shop the same way as you do, extremely high-skilled, say, editor in film and television.
And this kind of, just to track back on a bit of what you've just said, really points to, so that point of, the difference between, feeling it and acting and not understanding, the difference between seeing making decisions based on those top-level aggregates of, large numbers in certain kinds of employment. And this is something that I think, some good work needs to go into in the aftermath of this, is the way that government understands the industry and the way that we're presenting ourselves as the industry. So, for example, a lot of people working casually in hospitality have lost their jobs. A lot of those people are artists or arts workers or production people, or people working in a lot of different, according to the ATO, in terms of how people identify their primary, their principal occupation. There's only one option on your tax return. So we don't know how many artists there are in Australia. I get asked this question all the time. According to the Australia Council's Making Art Work report, there are about 50,000. According to the Bureau of Communications and Arts Research, there are more than 600,000 people who work in the sector, which they call, it's not the ABS statistic, it's the Bureau of Communications, the Office of Communications and the Arts. And so that figure, with 600,000 people, and the figure that's often used, as we've discussed before, there are problems with this, that $111.7 billion figure, as the total size of that sector, it actually omits a great proportion of the visual arts, as we've discussed before, but it includes things like computer games, software development, and so on. So we've got a definitional problem, we've got a self-identifying problem, we've got a problem when it comes to the way that Centrelink and the ATO don't talk to each other, for example, so that artists can income average and receive benefits at different times. And then we've also got, compounding all of this, the decision by the government to not support local government, not support state government, not support universities at this time. And so I keep thinking about a report from the Australia Institute. I don't know if you saw this, George, that their report from a couple of months ago or less now that looked at principles for stimulus. So you want effective stimulus, you focus on employment intensive industries where maybe people's average income isn't massive, so they're going to spend the majority of what they get. There are strong industry interdependencies, therefore spend $1, there'll be that multiplier. And if you look at a whole bunch of industries on that measure, arts is one of the ones that will come out on top. So different ways of making that judgment rather than those aggregates. I think there's absolutely been an element of, you know, a bit of panic kind of, okay, we need to make a decision, let's look at the aggregates in front of us.
Yeah, and it's not even a sort of conscious decision to declare a sector expendable. It's how a government prioritises in crisis.
Yeah.
Now, just let's tease out this discussion about numbers.
Yes.
I always thought for the arts sector the danger is in the double counting, in trying to make governments understand how important it is. Before you know it, everybody, and look, believe it or not, the mining sector do this as well.
Yeah.
Mining, big income generator, very, very small employer.
Yeah, and being automated more and more, which is why all studies show us.
Except mining will. The other one that does it, and they do it well, unfortunately, is the property sector. Right? So the multipliers that they add to the multipliers, and it's really just sort of bunching in anything and everything. Before you know it, you know, they're responsible for a quarter of GDP or something, which makes no sense, right?
Oh, exactly.
So, these arguments you can dead end yourself very, very quickly doing it that way. The other part to it is to think about, and this is what COVID's forcing us to do. COVID's forcing us in the end to decide what sort of society we want coming out of lockdown. Because of these transactions and these challenges are epic, and as soon as the long growth run ends, this is what happens. We start to figure out what's expendable. Now, I will use this phrase, what is expendable and what is non-negotiable. And what is non-negotiable, you'd have to think what is non-negotiable is a country that understands itself. And a country that can tell its stories, right? And this is a very, very difficult period at the moment. And well, look, even though it's an economics background, and I've written a couple of books about how the open model was sort of second to none in Australia and how we survived the GFC and all that. But I find that idea that you'd keep applying economics through something like this, just economics, is the wrong way. You're really wrong end of the telescope at the moment. So here's another way to think about it. So here's another way to think about it. So you think about the time and place we're in now. We're at the tail end of a very, very long experiment in leading up to the individual, and the government transferring risk across to the household sector. So we know the government now goes out of its way to pay us to consume privately, health insurance, education. So it thinks that we could look after ourselves. Crisis like this comes, and of course, if you sort of left it to the individual to manage this crisis, we'd all be broke by now, which is why the government has had to spend the money it's had to spend. But it's spending the money it's still spending the money in a neoliberal kind of way, because it's spending the money in a way that props up the private part of the economy, so the private part of the economy can kickstart the recovery. Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg, they talk about it in these terms. In the 70s, and I'll take us back a few steps to when we were kids, and not even born yet in your case, because you're a bit younger than me. So in the 70s, it never occurred to people in the 70s, as unemployment was going from 2% in 1973 to 5% by 1975 and then 10% by the end of the decade, or in the early 80s. It never occurred to people then that you didn't want an arts sector. And in fact, we know in terms of the culture, there's a very, very vibrant, sort of very nationalistic, very Australia first, not just in film and in literature, but in, you know, mid-brow and low-brow, television, countdown, all this sort of stuff. People feel Australia it was the first and best definition of Australia was that 70s version of Australia. Now, could you imagine Whitlam or Fraser, or even going into Hawke and Keating deciding, no, I don't want to hear from any of you.
No,
I don't want to hear from any of you. I want you to go pick fruit. Right? Well, I want you to blah, blah, blah. I want to redeploy you here because we're not job ready here. Certainly if you're sticking around to go to uni, I certainly don't want you to do an arts course. What the hell? So it makes no sense when you see how we handled the last crisis. It literally makes no sense. But that generation, and this is, if Menzies was still alive at that point, Menzies would have, even though he's retired at that point, wouldn't have seen anything untoward in terms of the social safety net response. You could go on the dole. You could, stay off the unemployment queues by going to uni. And all these things would have been encouraged. At the moment now, it's, right, shut down. Oh, you're doing this thing I don't understand. I've been a little more critical now, but this is what we were doing after we laid out the tracks of all the pressures they're under. Now let's think about it in a sort of cultural and strategic sense. If you think, well, what you want outside after lockdown is just basically a whole lot of worker bees that are match fit for particular private transactions, and I'll get you off the books as quickly as I possibly can because I don't like carrying all this debt. I wouldn't justify, as an economist, I wouldn't justify that society.
No. And this goes to the thinking and that future visioning that you've been developing in your past few books and TV series, really looking at the future, the nation that we're creating, what the long-term view is, why is it that in the last few years that long-term view has been collapsed. Something that, of course, arts and culture gives us is the capacity to envision. It's not just about critical thinking and creativity. It's not just about, ethics and risk and so on, but it is about being able to foresee a future. But it really feels in recent years as though the political outlook, the political horizon has flattened has really collapsed to that next election. So is it something... Is it lost from the political agenda? Have they forgotten how to do big infrastructure, whether that's cultural or visionary?
Yeah. So I'll glass half full it for you. So the thing about the global pandemic and the thing about the sort of health response, the thing about the collaborative leadership model that we saw in the National Cabinet, the Prime Minister wasn't just dictating terms to the states. The states controlled health, education, and police, so they could also enforce social distancing. They had the three levers to pull in terms of the public health response. Scott Morrison loves the National Cabinet. The National Cabinet to him works better than his own cabinet and his own backbench because he's there with people who can make decisions, or test propositions, make decisions, and then action them.
Yeah, and they're highly motivated as as political leaders themselves to make decisions together.
Yes, the line is breathing in their face, right? So this is fear kicks in at that point. Fear kicks in at this particular point because infection curve was going up. It was tracking literally at the same pace as Britain's, and we're about a week or two away from a blowout, and then we wouldn't have been able to handle it because we know that the way this virus runs. There's a tipping point beyond which, because it's highly infectious, there's a tipping point beyond which the health system can't cope with that. And no amount of lockdown can stop it at that point. And all you hear, because your streets are quiet, all you hear are ambulances. So we've avoided that. So I would look at that as the beginnings of a reopening of a much better policy discussion for the next 10 years. So you were sort of nudging me in the direction of capacity for politics to think long term again. We know that the decade that we've just come out of, and it wasn't the first complacent decade, by the way. I think the beginnings of the 21st century, sort of that once we sort of got out of the GST, and then went into the mining boom, things got very complacent in that final term of John Howard's government. A lot of checks been written because a lot of money was coming in from the mining boom, but not much long-term thinking. That was about around the time, I was still at the Australian at the time, it was around the time that we were souping up our coverage in Newsroom. So every fortnight, front page story. Nothing was happening, front page story. Something did happen, front page story the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day. Some days we'd let it go, but most times we talk about the poll rather than the policy. And then policy gets announced. If the poll numbers are no good, people drop the policy. So we know that has been in the waters for quite a while now in terms of the way politics is run. Of course, that last decade we've just been through, because we've been through that revolving door. Do you want to count them up? Remember, because today's the 10th anniversary of Julia Gillard's June 24th.
That's
Julia
right.
Gillard became Prime Minister today 10 years ago in a coup. The night before, Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister 10 years ago. So we went Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott. Abbott won an election, by the way, so all power to him. And then he's gone by 2015. So we've got 5 in 5 years. And then we've had another couple since. So, and the rest of the world finally noticed by the time Morrison got the job, because then they realised that we were rolling a Prime Minister every 2 years. The other thing they realised, by the way, is that we were a laggard on climate change. And when did they work that out? During the Black Summer of fires across the country, and when no one here wanted to talk about climate change, even though it looked to the rest of the world about climate change. Like the future had announced itself, paradise was being torched. This great country, Australia, was facing an existential threat. So looking back on not just the first decade, but especially the second decade, with the leadership changes, with the obsession about polling, and with the refusal to deal with big challenges, things like climate change, you would hope that you wouldn't have another decade like the last one. And the coronavirus would be the trigger for a much, well, sane's not the right word, but a much more meaningful conversation. Because I think a lot of the problem in the previous decade was that it didn't appear that there were many problems to solve immediately. So politics can get very, very distracted very quickly when there are big picture reforms, big picture challenges. So you could theoretically have these arguments, but once you drop them, you have another one, and then you have another one, and you have another one, and sooner or later you realise that the only thing I can do to influence the political outcome is to roll a lever. So it was a dynamic of the last 10 years. I just hope that's gone.
I hope so too, but it's hard to kind of, I think compounding that, and we discussed this a little last week, given we're looking at the media these 3 weeks, is of course the real collapse of the media in Australia and in other parts of the world. Whether we saw the collapse of print some time ago, and the confusion of very staid conservative boards to rethink their media models. We've now had what looked like the death and now hopefully the resurrection of AAP, the ongoing cuts to the ABC. We've seen today another 250 redundancies and the end of the 7:45 AM broadcast and a range of other. And then, of course, across the last 20, 30 years, really since Keating, a significantly reduced diversity of media ownership. And so then when you look at poll reporting, of course, a newspaper who also runs the polling is going to report on the polling that it has itself commissioned. And then there's that, vicious cycle with the change of leadership, because leadership speculation does sell papers and encourage click-throughs. What is going to break that? Because I really can't see, how we're going to get beyond that cycle to open up that longer term thinking, both on the part of the media with some bigger, investigations and approaches, but also on the part of politicians who we rely on to think in that meaningful way. I think that's such a good word, George. It's, we need meaningful governance.
Yeah. It's difficult, obviously, because the media, there's so many things you can't recreate in a sort of 21st century context, because that disruption that digital has brought to not just the way media operates. So, the news cycle is set up, and there's literally no news cycle now. You've got the structural problem. So, we know what the structural problem is. You can't pay for the thing now through the old classified and display advertising model, because a lot of it now it's gone online. So as obviously the media organisations, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about a newspaper or a broadcast or online only, they don't have enough reporters on the ground to be able to long-term thinking is not even what I'm describing here. Just simply being able to report what the impact of public policy is.
Yeah.
I'll give you one example. It actually helps sometimes to frame it through some of the personal work that I've done. So when I first moved back to Melbourne for the Australian turn of the 21st century, I was able to take a month off the roster to investigate the trade in water. Now, it seems like a pretty obtuse topic, but at the time we had a deregulation of the Murray-Darling Basin, and there was a trial in the corner of South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales, where water was being traded. Now, to take a month off for any story today, for something like that was very, very interesting for a national readership. Well, you'd take a year off to work out whether Dyson paid and obviously had a problem in his interpersonal
Absolutely massive.
So, okay, you go for something that big, right? But you could only go for something that big. So that is a story about an individual, which obviously does have some cultural and process implications. But the more interesting issue is that 10 years on from that little water trial experiment I was able to do for months. Can you imagine getting a month off to do anything apart from something like that? So 10 years later, we finally introduced the carbon price, which was for that single term of the Gillard government. I couldn't internally, and I know none of my colleagues could do it either, we couldn't convince anyone internally, and the ABC didn't do it, Fairfax at the time didn't do it, and certainly News couldn't do it, to take a month off and go out and see how that carbon price was working in the real world. So 10 years later, if you couldn't write that story, how do you think you can discipline the political class in understanding the implications of policy? So if you can't even get out there to show what the policy looks like on the ground, you can't help them improve it because it's had contact with the real world, but you can't show them where it's working and where it's not working. They don't learn anything that way. Of course, they've talked about 6 other things since then. So part of it is on them because they don't spend days, weeks, months through the implementation phase of public policy getting it right, because you're going to make mistakes once you've implemented something. So it's a bit. So there's sort of a codependency in very, very short-term thinking, both between media and politics.
Yeah.
You can kind of fix that by empowering your public service, but at the same time, of course, the public service has been repurposed.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
It goes in a survival mode on behalf of Minister. So Minister's drowning a lot. So Minister wants a stack of briefing notes from the public service so they can handle the sort of firestorm of the day. Whereas you probably need a bigger proportion of your public service working on, in the unlikely event of a global pandemic, what would you need? Right? If Trump loses an election, how do we reposition ourselves for a world that suddenly wants to be progressive again? Climate change is coming. What does it look like when we finally have to get off our backsides?
This is really critical to the conversation we've been having across the last couple of months, but also last week and today as we then bring it back to the arts, because what you've just characterised, of course, is what makes it so very difficult for any issue in arts and culture in terms of either the industry or individuals or the economic impacts of COVID or any of the key issues to be investigated, to make news, to then have that be reflected back as something that the public is genuinely interested in, and then have that filter up to decision makers. We've got a number of questions now for you about kind of threading that back to the media and what can change. So I'm going to bring a couple of them together. Sarah Miller is asking, what could the media be doing better in terms of putting the argument for the arts and cultural sector? I'm conscious that not much is happening there, and why not? And then Gabrielle Sullivan kind of asks the rejoinder to that, which is, what benefit is there for the mainstream media to champion the arts? And I think that's really interesting, that of course, we in many ways are accustomed to thinking of the media and journalism as of being of the public interest, being a public service. But of course, it is a set of businesses who look at how they're going to stay afloat. So 2 big questions for you, George.
They are very big questions. So in terms of how would the media advocate, I'm sort of less interested in how the media would advocate. Let me sort of explain how journalists think about these things. The idea of us advocating for a public good, whilst theoretically it sounds like a good idea, it actually does take us off our jobs. And it could be the arts one day, but maybe I want to advocate for something else that you don't like. So I think the idea of having media focused on advocacy is a difficult thing for media. But I think media understanding that there is a complexity in our community and that there's an argument for a bigger Australia, that there's an argument for a more cohesive Australia, that means giving voice to the people who don't have a voice at the moment. Now, I don't mean just in terms of diversity. I mean, if your media is full of just sport and the share market and celebrity, the missing bit is the culture, right? So you have to, rather than advocating for the culture, report the culture.
Yes.
Give the culture a voice. And of course, most media operations now are multi-platform. So there's a possibility for experimentation, even if you don't want it to be in your paper because it's too expensive to produce in your paper. You've got more eyeballs on your digital page. You can start to move stuff onto your main page that looks like culture. And the other thing is, and this is something that media is struggling with at the moment because it's in survival mode, it needs to partner. And partner doesn't mean I'm going to partner with a casino. I'm going to tell my reader, I'm going to give my readers a free lotto card in Saturday's paper. It means partnering with institutions that have audiences. And of course, the thing about arts and culture is they've got a big audience, right? And it doesn't mean the reason why I'm partnering with them is so I could then sell them something. The reason why I'm partnering with them is so I can connect. I could actually try to restore the thing that media used to do before the disruption, which is basically be tapped into as much of Australia as possible. So, you know, it could then build what your new mainstream looks like because it had everybody involved. I mean, I remember when I first started out at the Melbourne Sun, and this is obviously a different era. So
a couple of years ago.
A couple of years ago in the mid-'80s, that paper, because advertising could support it, that paper, no matter where you went in that paper, every part of Victorian life in those days was covered at some point in that paper. And that should almost be your first principle all the way through. So I think the difficulty within the existing environment is, so that the structural challenge is you don't have enough bodies to be able to produce this content across the board. Well, that's why you probably need to think about partnering.
Tell us more about what no, I'm interested in what you mean by partnering, because that's super interesting. And when I look back on, you know, the last kind of heyday of the print media and newspapers making some good money, we had a range of partnerships, particularly here in Melbourne in the 2000s. At the time when I was running Melbourne Fringe, it was called the Age Melbourne Fringe Festival and the Age Melbourne Writers Festival. There were substantial corporate sponsorships, as well as a range of partnerships that were around, you know, give us access to your artists, we can interview them, let's talk about stories and so on. So how can those kind of partnerships work, and what should people in our group today be approaching local media, particularly in regional places, to propose partnerships?
This is something, and funnily enough, I can give you the concept, but I can't give you the detail of how it would work. How it would work is actually out there. So how it would work is just to think about your community. So you think about your audience and think about the story you're telling, and then make it your business to tell somebody in the media that you're aware of, or even if media you're not aware of, make it your business to tell them that this should be of interest to you. And it may be in the short term just a sponsorship of an event. But of course, again, this is sort of almost goes back to first principles of the way journalists work. One of the reasons why journalists like to get out there and don't appreciate the sort of, whilst they like working from home, I don't think they appreciate the absence of contact with other human beings, is to swap the business cards, is to get a different perspective, is to add to your contact book. So the idea of a community organisation, if you're thinking small and you're thinking regional or local paper, even though a lot of them are getting knocked over at the moment, if you could make it your business to get to know the media in your area, and then make it their business to know why they need your audience. That first round of engagement, I think a lot of organisations don't even think along these lines because media seems too remote to them. But at the same time, you're expecting them to acknowledge you. So why aren't we in there? Well, one of the reasons you may not be in there is that it didn't occur to them, obviously. It's a bit like the government's attitude at the moment. It's not necessarily deliberate. But after you make yourself aware, after you've made yourself aware to them, most media organisations will say, thank you.
And they're super glad to be in touch. I think it's a really important point, and we're going to focus our entire next week's session on how to be a media spokesperson. We're going to have the artist Abdullah and publicist Jane Morey go through and talk to us about a situation that happened late last year where Abdul's work was the subject of a political attack in Queensland by a coordinated approach between a local councillor who was hoping to run for mayor and George Christensen. So we've got some very interesting conversations to have next week. Oh my God. Yeah, you'll have to. It's going to be a corker, that one. We are rapidly approaching the hour, and I just want to see if people have got final questions for George. But George, to wrap up, I want to ask you about one of the really important aspects of George's work is looking at Australia demographically and culturally, looking at the Australia that isn't about the way that politicians of whatever party might imagine it, but looking at the strongly diverse Australia, which for some reason tends to keep being ignored or imagined away by governments who would prefer, as you were saying earlier, perhaps an older, whiter Australia. What do our demographic trends tell us about some of the reasons why it's more and more important for government to be looking at arts and culture when it comes to identity and our changing identity, especially around those questions we've also been discussing a little bit in the last few weeks around social cohesion and the broader, sense of what it means to be Australian today?
Yeah. In fact, one of the reasons, almost the first reason you want the government to reprioritise or to make the arts a priority is that they need to be able to hear from as many voices as possible that are shooting for the prize, which is to be able to write or to tell or to show or to imagine a cohesive 21st century national narrative. And view it this way: if you want to think mechanically, if you want to think like a neoliberal, you're contracting out to the arts community a unifying national story, which I can then repurpose for politics, right? So I'm trying to get into the head of a politician who just thinks politics and then incentivize them to think on behalf of the nation. Now, the country, and this is how I tend to describe it, and it's interesting that we've crossed the threshold to majority migrant a year before the lockdown. So the lockdown that we're in at the moment has found the country close to 30% born overseas, another 21% of you and me, Esther, at least one migrant parent. So first and second generation Australia now is the majority. You add another 3 from Indigenous, so you get to 54. So you get, there's obviously a lot of whites in the first and second generation because you've got a lot of white migration, but essentially new Australia and First Peoples is 54% of the population. That means 46% of the population, even though they get to decide elections, is the third generation or older. Now that part of Australia, I've got a lot of empathy for that part of Australia because they think their country is changing too quickly. And I understand their instinct to try and hang on to what we were. But the problem with Australia as we defined ourselves when we became a federation in 1901, we defined ourselves by who we didn't want to be. So the White Australia policy said we wanted to be white, but White Australia was was set against the idea of what shouldn't be Australian. So we didn't want to be Asian. We didn't want to be black. Obviously didn't count Indigenous Australians in the census at the time. We wanted to disappear them as human beings in a sort of political and representational sense. Obviously, we're not that Australia anymore. We can't be that Australia that defines away the 10% of the population that we're not, because the majority of Australia is something else again. To be able to unify that story, to be able to write a cohesive story on behalf of the 54 plus the 46, I would tend to argue I'd want to hear from the 3% that are Indigenous, because I think they're in a better position to unify that story between you and North Australia, because I've been here all along. And the idea of a welcome country is not a bad unifying story, because in essence, we've been a migrant nation since 1788. So that's what I'd be looking for. Politically, it's very hard to think this way, because politically, you would never trust a politician who spoke to you this way, because the other side will go, oh, well, he's come up with this or she's come up with this. I'm sort of duty bound as a member of the other side to oppose them. So you can't get cohesion at that point, which is why, again, I would be, if I was this government, I'd be encouraging people who want to dream that particular dream of a unifying national story. I wouldn't be going out there funding them, with the following: you can't criticise the government and you must honour this particular statue, or, written and authorised by. That's not what you do, because you don't know what it is they're going to come up with. As the Chinese said, for different reasons, because Mao then decided that 1,000 flowers wouldn't bloom, but you'd want to let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? And consider it. One of the reasons why I'm talking sort of mechanically, I know most of the audience doesn't think this way, but we're also thinking about how you communicate to people in government who only think in those binary economic terms. This is what research and development is like in business, right? You have to try a number of ideas. This is what happens in medicine. You have to try a number of,
yes.
Vaccine for coronavirus. You have to try a lot of things. You can't. You know what you're looking for, but you don't know what it looks like. So if you say it needs to look like this, you never get there. And this is part of the creative journey. There's a lot of risk and there's a lot of uncertainty in the creative journey, but I'd much rather be in that country than the country that we're sort of leaning towards, which is risk averse, which is trying to reimpose a monoculture on what is a very, very complex society, and is also doing what? It's afraid of the future.
Yeah. Oh, you just put your finger on exactly the kind of Australia. Oh, what's that? Have we had a technical problem?
Just a small technical problem. Sorry about that.
George?
I can hear you.
Oh, that's okay. Well, I can still hear you. Yeah. It might have just been a little hiccupy glitch, but we are back. George was just saying the last I heard about, the kind of future that we want to be able to create, one that does embrace risk and confidence and adventurous thinking, and that, we would think that, good government should be going out of their way to be fostering exactly that. George, it has been so fantastic to have you join us. It's really, really great to just get a sense of, Australia most broadly, to get a sense of where this area of policy does and doesn't fit in, the places where it kind of should be fitting in, and the ways that, we can be engaging with the media to make sure that cultural stories and broader visioning is heard. So big thank you to George.
And thank you,
everyone.
Thank you to everyone who tuned in.
Yes, everyone, thank you. Let's thank George. We're going to stick around till 12:30, but please, in the whatever clapping way is possible, as we do in our different ways of just filling that stream with there we go. We have attempts at emojis, and also lots of thanks. Great food for thought. Thanks, Anne. And there you go. Someone has managed to get the emoji in there. Excellent. All right, George, thank you, and love to everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks again.
All right, so George is going to find that button and then leave us, which he has just done. And isn't it always great to hear from someone who can just give us that, that big kind of explaining of, in a very broad, long-term sense, what arts and culture has meant, not just to, this government, but to different Liberal governments over the period. I really appreciated his point that if we were to, revive Robert Menzies, he would be looking around Australia very confused at the moment, because that sense of, fostering national pride for what that might mean to each of us through arts and culture, is supremely important. Let's unpack some of what George said, and then let's start to talk about our progress towards Arts Day on the Hill and the different actions that are going to be so important for us to be taking from now for the next few weeks. I have just missed a call from the Minister's advisor. I hope that's going to be good news. I have heard rumours that there is going to be an announcement about the arts tomorrow, so I will give her a call back a little bit later. That would be funny to do live now, but obviously I won't be doing that. Now, who's got some questions that we didn't get to put to George, so that we can unpack a little bit of what he was saying? Enter those in the chat there. I'm going to look back to see some of the other questions that people contributed, and lots of points in the chat about how a much bigger transformation is needed. Miriam Aboud makes the point that media is one of the great pillars of democracy. Arts and culture is vital for community connection. These things are not always commercial propositions. We need transformations of values. It sounds like miners, supermarkets and property developers are the only ones not in survival mode. Yeah, it has been interesting to see that retail has been, of course, thriving at this time, and not just, everyday essentials or hoarding retail. George was saying earlier, he's worried that we will have a bit of a second lockdown vibe in Victoria, and that people might start, getting into that panic buying behaviour again. Who's got some questions or anything that struck you as something that we do need to talk a little bit more about in something that, George, I can see the couple of people typing at the moment. And while people are typing, I will talk about what is happening over the next few weeks. And I've just been trying to, upload a version of the next kit, which is available, which will soon be available on the NAVA website, which have just been putting the finishing touches on today, and that's got a few activities in it that are about stuff that you can do individually, but stuff that you kind of role play as well in terms of understanding the media, but also pitching stories and pitching yourself as well, getting to know media sources, getting to know media colleagues, becoming a source. So getting into that relationship where you are, as George was saying, in the context of partnering, having this relationship, this ongoing conversation where you are letting a journalist or a radio producer, whoever is local to you, letting them know what the key issues are from your point of view, perhaps giving them that heads up on a few intriguing things, but also getting to know what the pressures are from their point of view. And it takes us back to what Michaela was saying last week about the difficulty sometimes of pitching something as news when she knows that it's going to be a big story. And I'm certainly worried after today's announcements of just how much more difficult that is going to be. Those of us who've been following friends and colleagues who are journalists online today, have been really concerned about, the range of the challenges that people are facing right now. So Josie's just asked, how do we do that with politicians and decision makers who value things only in terms of their dollar value? Sarah's pointing out that, of course, there are a lot of organisations who are building relationships with the media, and the question for her is always why they, like government, don't seem to be listening, and journalists can't get stories through. So we've just had, some great analysis from George about some of the big difficulties in that. There are fewer people doing that pitching who are then able to be there are fewer people doing that investigative work. There are fewer people, being able to get those stories out there. Now, I've just had a go at uploading the updated handbook. Can you see that now on your screen? Because I've just been having some difficulties. Caroline Phillips, you are absolutely right. I'm also, and I'm a little worried about this, everyone, I've just been starting to get some error messages that my internet connection is unstable, which hopefully it won't be offended by. I'm sure it's a very stable, genius internet connection. But I'm very much hoping that it's going to hold up at this end for the next 20 minutes, because so far the internet gods have been smiling on me. Can you now see on the screen, through my unstable connection, the cover of our Understanding the Media section? You can. Oh, okay, excellent. So we go through and talk about what Arts Day on the Hill and the advocacy program is. We've talked in the last weeks about what some of the key issues are and what advocacy is, maintaining those ongoing conversations. We had a good look and a bit of a laugh at my very brief history of arts policy in Australia. Again, this kit is available for NAVA members only. It will be on our website tomorrow, this one in particular, looking at a very brief history of arts policy in Australia, is a very handy kind of like a one-page primer before you're talking to an MP. We also talked about, well, what is Australia's arts policy and activity in selecting a recent policy change or funding cut, and asking on what basis and what are the principles. We heard from Jackie Bailey at the BYP group and looked at some global comparisons in terms of how our policy sits and what it means, in that broader context, particularly looking at what the COVID response has been. And then last week, and I touched on this and it is now in the kit, that question of why is it so hard for art stories to make news? And I mentioned last week, and it's now in the kit, the 7 news values that people are taught in journalism school, that something will make news if it's a bit unusual, so it's different to the norm. It's current, it's got some connection to what people are already thinking and talking about. There's some conflict involved, so it's going to capture people's interest. It's got impact, perhaps because it's so severe, it's so major, it's going to affect people's lives. Prominence, perhaps there is a celebrity or a politician or someone who's got a profile already is part of the story. Proximity, it's either happening near you or in the same country, so the same news across the world is not going to make it onto our headlines and so on here. And timeliness, the fact that it has just happened, it's reaching you as quickly as it possibly can. And when we look at those values and ask ourselves a question. This is we've just covered actually a lot of these questions this evening, and particularly last week. What kinds of stories get into the news section? Why don't we see more detailed investigative journalism? How has the media landscape changed? But when we look at these 7 values, George touched on this a few times this evening in referring to sport. We can instantly see why sport regularly makes news and art stories don't. Sport has got a narrative that people can follow. There's conflict, obviously, between the teams, and stories often told as though it's about battles and so on. It's going to have some currency and proximity because many people are invested in following their team. It's got stats that can be used, and certainly this is why political polling is used so often in news stories. As George was saying, the easiest thing in the world is to grab polls, make it a story of the personalities who are having this jostle for leadership, and then a story kind of comes through. And so that is something that makes it difficult when we're pitching for stories. But if those are the kinds of, and I'm sure that you've all seen stories that you recognise as aligning with some of these kinds of values, what are some art stories that you've seen recently that are absolutely news and have filtered up, have actually made it through this set of news values filters? What are some art stories that you've seen lately, particularly around COVID, that you've thought, yeah, great that that's been covered and I can understand why that's made news? Has anyone got an example of a recent news story in the arts that you've been really pleased to see actually make news? And Sarah's talking about a friend, Professor Jane Goodall, who wrote The Politics of the Common Good, who's interested in whether the arts sector would be interested in rethinking economics to take us beyond money as the only indicator of value, the new monetarist, etc. I wonder if there's a story that might be worked up there. Sarah, there are a lot of researchers who look at exactly that, different kinds of cultural value. People like Justin O'Connor, Ben Eltham, the team at Deakin, the team at UniSA, at QUT Centre of Excellence on the Creative Industries, Monash, of course. And thank you, Louise, to that link to... see, that is such a great example, that story. An arts degree has long been the butt of predictable jokes, but there's another side where even the ABC feels like they need to sort of temper this with, oh, yes, you're probably going to find this funny and cliched, but look, it's actually quite serious. So it's like, there's a stereotype here that we have to pander to, which is really frustrating, isn't it? When you want to dispel a stereotype, the last thing you want to do is be referring to that stereotype. You actually want to move beyond the stereotype. Look, these an understanding of these kinds of questions can help us to really think about how we pitch and how we connect. Gabrielle Sullivan says, hi, Esther. Hi, Gabrielle. I can see that she's typing some more, and I will keep looking in that direction to see the question as I flip to the next page in our How to Engage with the Media section of the handbook. And so with a few pointers here about becoming a source, knowing the angle, and reframing the question, which then leads to group activity, which I really encourage you to get into together. So becoming a source, and George touched on this earlier, getting to know editors and producers of your local media and consistently offering them useful background so that you can be approached as a valuable go-to person. Knowing the angle. When you're being interviewed for a story, being aware that the journalist or the presenter has already decided on their angle before they've pursued you. So last week, I think it was last week, someone had that great question about, you see choreographers or dancers interview. They always ask the question of, well, did you want to do this? So, was this something that you wanted to do when you were little, and what did you want to be, and educational background, and what was it like at school? Because, of course, the journalist is thinking about their audience, who will be interested in how tremendous that this person has such a successful arts career. How did that happen for them? And so it is often, really important to be prepared to answer, to the extent that you're comfortable, some personal questions to make it possible for people to relate to what you do, to relate to not just your practice, but why you became an artist, how it's possible to sustain a career as an artist. I think, we would be a better country if we had more stories in the media about just what it takes to maintain a practice, what it means in terms of, meaningfulness, as George was saying earlier, and the values with which we live our lives. And also when you're being interviewed, particularly when it's not live to air, feel comfortable to ask what their angle is or what the focus of the story will be. There's nothing worse than being quoted in a story which is very different to what you imagined that it was going to be like. I've had an experience like this recently where a journalist interviewed me many weeks ahead of a story coming out, and then I was quoted in The Australian alongside people who were saying that, I think, the diverse voices that we need to be hearing from, just need to shut up and stop telling middle white Australia that they're doing everything wrong. And I thought, oh my God, I was horrified to be quoted alongside that person, and certainly didn't share that story anywhere. More recently, a journalist got in touch just today. Oh, bye, Andy. Nice to see you again. A journalist got in touch recently, just today, and had a series of questions that he put in advance in writing, and one of them was extremely problematic, and I let him know immediately when we spoke on the phone, and I said that I wouldn't participate in an interview if he was going to be pursuing that angle, and thankfully he said that he would not, and so we proceeded. So yeah, always important to ask when a journalist does that. But if it's live to air, you can always reframe a question. When you're asked a question that you don't want to answer, you can reframe that. You can, and this does take practice if you're not used to doing live interviews. An important thing is to go in already prepared with, what is it that you want to say? Is it as simple as you've got a show that you want to promote? Or there's a particular issue, they take you somewhere in a personal direction, they ask you something very specific that you don't want to talk about. You can simply deflect and say, oh, look, I get asked that question a lot, but, what I'd really like to talk about today is blah. The good thing about a live interview is that time is very limited. The journalist will not have time to go back to that question, and what you articulate will be the focus and the dominance of the interview. Gabrielle says she hit the wrong button, and she wanted to add something to the history of federal government art support. She'd always thought it was John Gorton who established the Australia Council. Actually, he seems to have established the predecessor. Yeah, that's right. So the Commonwealth Literary Fund and the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board, those, of course, predate the Australia Council. And the very first thing that happened in arts funding in Australian history was in 1912. And in fact, it's a little bit ahead of that. Before the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board was established, there was a literary fund And that was the very first arts funding in Australia was for Australian writers. And it was a very nationalistic approach. It was, you know, we need Australian stories to be told here and overseas. And so that was the first funding. But the appointment of an art advisory board was where we first started to have a policy focus. And so Gorton comes in a little bit later. But yes, it was the Holt government that announced the Australia Council, the establishment of the Australia Council in November 1967. And then, of course, it was the Whitlam government who then enacted it, given that that took some years to develop. So there is a bit of ping pong that happens here, of course, where someone sets something up by the time the government changes and so on. Yeah, so that kind of... that continues, except that in more recent years, as George pointed out, with those leadership changes, those timelines of leadership change have collapsed so much. It collapsed right down. And so it's so hard to look at the long term, particularly when this sort of thing starts to happen and you have quite destructive approaches. Now, next week, we are going to look at... we're going to hear from, that's the next page, as we're saying, Abdullah and Jane Morey about how to be a media spokesperson. And then hopefully, Adam, the week after that with our Q&A with a politician. But of course, what we're leading towards is Arts Day on the Hill and the steps that we will all take. In the few minutes that we have left, tell me now, who has been so far using this kit to contact politicians, and in particular around some COVID-19 stuff? There's a lot that NAVA and others have been advocating for, because we, of course, are going to really turn up the volume on this as we head into August, in particular, as we start doing our political engagement session as well. So I'm going to be really counting on everyone to be very active when those weeks approach, so that we've really got a lot of us well distributed across the country on a really substantial advocacy push. Oh, thank you to those people who need to be heading off. So have a look at the kit if you are a NAVA member. Again, NAVA membership starts at just $7.50 a month. Leah posted the link earlier, and I'm just going to post it again. There we go. And that you'll also get a sense of, you know, just the bigger, broader advantages of NAVA membership in terms of supporting your practice, building the sector and its capacity, and of course amplifying the voice of artists, which is very much the focus of this program. So yes, let me know in the chat there whether you have been getting in touch with MPs, and I think in particular two MPs that it will be really important for all of us to get in touch with is, of course, Maria van Bakenor and John Alexander, who have presented, who are keen to be sharing your thoughts and experiences. Oh, great, Adam, that's fantastic. Especially as we suspect that some kind of package will be announced tomorrow, it's going to be so important that we're all ready with some kind of response. And this is one that is really, really difficult, thinking about, you know, how we want to respond at this time, because, of course, you know, we don't always have, you know, we're not necessarily in whatever is announced tomorrow, we're not necessarily going to have an announcement that is going to be of assistance to everyone. Miriam, the answer to your question is on the screen right now, and this will be on the website tomorrow for download. So going to some of the things that we've been hearing from people who've been advising us about how to engage with MPs, if the package that's announced tomorrow is not perfect and doesn't achieve everything that we need, how are people going to respond? I'd be very keen for your thoughts on this in the minute or two that we have left, because it's a really difficult, diabolical question. On the one hand, we might feel frustrated and disappointed. On the other hand, we've got to keep in mind that Arts Minister Paul Fletcher has been working for probably a couple of months on trying to get his parliamentary colleagues, particularly the Prime Minister, to understand the value of arts and culture and the value of the industry so that they can support it. And so if we come across as, and of course there'll be criticism of it, and that's really important. But if we come across as though whatever the package is not of value to us, then those politicians who we need to sway might think, oh, we invested those hundreds of millions of dollars for nothing. So I am asking everyone, particularly if you're on social media, that when that announcement gets made tomorrow, think about how to respond, how to tag in an MP or the Prime Minister, how to connect this to the current conversations we've been having, how to connect this to what they value, as JA and Maria were saying to us, so that if there is an announcement tomorrow, if they are actually going to invest, that investment is valued and that the relationships can continue. So that's my advice for us as we look at the whatever is announced tomorrow. I'm very much looking forward to next week and presenting a conversation between Abdul Abdullah and Jane Morey about how to be a media spokesperson, particularly because Abdul was really thrown in the deep end and did not have a nice time about this. Nobody would, being politically attacked. And I'm so impressed with how he got through. And it'll be great to see Jane Morey again, who was NAVA's publicist. Everyone, thank you very, very much. Thank you to Helen, who's been live captioning for us. Thank you to Leah. And I will see everyone at the same time next week. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Night, everyone.